Another person who has made a great contribution to this field is sitting to my left, Dr. Ruth Clark. Dr. Clark has been in this field a long time. I am in the enviable position of choosing the speakers for this event. So I pick people who I find interesting and meet a need and that I like personally. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Clark. She is the author of 6 books. It might even be 7 now. I'm losing track. And I'm envious that she's such a prolific writer. I wish I could get one out. Dr. Clark, I believe her latest book was just released last month. Is that correct, Ruth? I really like her work, because one of the things I like about her work is that it's based on real research, because e-learning has a lot of critics, and Ruth's work is based on research, where it's not just cool to do things a certain way online. She has it based on sound research that shows that we had a control group and we had an experimental group, and it's proven using our experiments that learning works better this way. So without any further introduction, I want to introduce Dr. Ruth Clark. Ruth?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, and thanks to UMBC for hosting my trip and my visit out here. And I bring you greetings from the great Southwest. I'm from Colorado, where it was really cold, about 17 degrees on Sunday. So I'm now on my way to Arizona, which happily is my winter home too. So with virtual technology, I can live anywhere, get online, and communicate with my students and so forth. So it's a pleasure to be here, and appreciate very much the opportunity. My work is primarily working with corporations, organizations, government, private, nonprofit, to think about ways to exploit the various delivery media we have, all the way from the good old-fashioned instructor up through the latest and greatest technologies to support human learning. And I want to share a little bit of that research with you tonight in my work. Basically, what I've tried to do is there is wonderful research out there. However, for most of you, you have lots of busy lives, and it's a lot of work to go out and find those research reports. They're in various journals, technical journals, and to find those and to synthesize those and to try to articulate them in a way that'll be relevant to practitioners. The academic research community is a separate community of practice compared to many of us who are practitioners. So I've tried to serve as a bridge, because it's a full-time job to plan and conduct research and to write up your findings, much less than to promote it outside of the academic community. So I've been trying to promote evidence-based practice, and I'll introduce you to some of my research colleagues who've actually produced the research. So I don't take any credit for the research except to try to synthesize and articulate it for you. Why do we need research? A lot of you have been around for a little while in our educational arena. And I think we're a field that's often characterized more by fads and fiction than we are sometimes by evidence of what works. So as in many fields, we have various enthusiasms that wax and wane, some of which have some real validity and some of which do not. So I think, what is a professional? A professional is somebody who knows not only what to do, but why. They know the reasoning behind it. They know the research behind it, so they are able to actually adjust to different situations. So a professional you have lots of things you have to consider, like things like budgets, political realities, timelines. Those are all legitimate things to consider. What delivery media do I have? But one of the things we want to factor in is evidence of what works. You can't make all your decisions on the basis of evidence, but I want to submit that it's one of the things that a professional will consider in evidence-based practice. And third, a professional is someone who, like you, here tonight, participates in a community of practice. And there's lots of communities of practice. I was around meeting some of you, and here we have some ASTD members here. Who are some of our ASTD members? Okay, good. So there's a great community of practice for many of you. Coming here to the university, talking to your colleagues and meeting your alumni and so forth, people you worked with. This is another community of practice. So I think those are the hallmarks of a profession. And I'm happy to say I think we are evolving in a professional direction from a craft approach where it was very much based on intuition and what felt right into looking at research. So here's your first question of the night. This is not a university-rated education or public education, but in business and industry, how much did we spend last year in training? Not university, not K through 12, but in business and industry. What do you think? Let's hear some guesses.
$2 billion.
Okay, so I heard someone say million. Did I hear any millions out there? No, okay, so 2 billion. I think I've heard 2 billion. And I think I've heard 50 billion. Any other guesses? 4 billion. Okay, good. So we can decide who we want to work for now, right here, thinking about what their budgets are going to be. I always like to start off all of my events with this statistic, because we really made a substantive investment in, then this is strictly, as I said, business and industry. Training Magazine publishes this every year. And this, by the way, is a small number. Because in your typical training event in a corporation, what's the most expensive part of the budget? It's absolutely right. It's the staff time, and that is not reflected in this figure. So the actual figure, if you incorporated the amount of time that people have invested, would be much, much higher. So probably someone estimated close to $300 billion investment. So what do we get for that investment? That's always the pressing question. What do we get? And usually the answer is, well, we don't really know. But I submit that if we have factored research into the design and delivery of our programs, we have a better chance of getting a return on investment. I saw a lot of you doing your pre-work. Good job. So let's do a show of hands here and see what you thought. And I have tried up on my slide to indicate what page we're kind of on. Not every single slide is in there, but a lot of the key points are in there to help you. So how many think that it's true that visuals improve learning? How many think yes? Okay, good. So we've got some visual advocates here. That's wonderful. Is this generally true? The more practice, the better the learning. How many feel that's a generally true statement? I saw, who says no, that's not, I don't agree with that. Okay, we have a few dissenters here. Okay, so there's some qualifiers, right? Okay, if you have a visual, is it better to explain it with text and audio than text alone? How many think that's true? Okay, good. How many think, no, I'm not so sure about that? So we're a little more divided on that one. Okay, when all's said and done, the heck with this distance learning stuff. Is learning better in a face-to-face classroom than in a virtual? How many think fundamentally that's true? Okay, good. That's why we're here tonight, right? Because we're face-to-face. How many say, no, I don't think that's true? Okay, good. So we have a pretty good mix on that one, too. If you're going to have practice, is it better to space them out, or is it better like to have your kind of your information and your content, and then like have a lab where the practice is concentrated? So how many think it's true when learning is better when the practice is spaced throughout? How many think that's a true statement? Okay, so good. We're advocates of spaced training. What about stories? How many of you include stories as a part of your training? Okay, we all do that. And what do you think? How many of you think interesting stories really improve learning? All right, well, we're going to see some of the evidence on all of these questions and see what happened. So just to get a level setting here, because in our field, we do not have consistency of terminology. If anybody wanted to take on a great project, it would be a great taxonomy that we would all buy into and agree on the term. But one way to divide the e-learning world, which in my day, way, way back, used to be called CBT, computer-based training, but we've had new buzzwords. We have the asynchronous forms, which in general is designed for self-study, especially in corporate settings. It's a self-study. Sometimes you have ways where you can go to a discussion board and you can communicate, but often it's a self-study. And you're, in the last 2 years, developing a national program of financial literacy, something I think that's kind of badly needed right now, right? Different courses, and right now I teach about 1/3 of my courses through the virtual classroom. How many of you have attended a webinar? Everybody just about. So this is what we're talking about here, where it's a live event. The instructor is there. I told Greg I don't like to use the camcorder because I don't really want people to see the webcam to see me. But they can hear me, they can see my slides. You can chat, as you know, you can get on audio and so forth. So this is the environment that I'm going to talk about tonight, the synchronous classroom, also called the virtual classroom and so forth. And we'll find out a little bit more about how many of you are using this as we go along. Same purpose, though, that we talked about before. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about when does it make sense to use a virtual classroom? What are some of the reasons that this could be useful? what is it that makes up an effective virtual classroom session? Visuals are one of my passions, so we're going to look at the research on visuals. Are they useful? What kinds of visuals are more useful? And how would we use them in the synchronous classroom? And engagement. How do we keep people engaged? So that's going to be our main little agenda points for tonight. But before we get too far down that road, I want you to have a little opportunity to network. Greg mentioned networking, and that is, why be face-to-face and never interact with the people around you? It doesn't make sense. So I have a scavenger hunt for you. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to see how many of these people you can find. You have the criteria in your handout. And part of the deliberate thing here is to get your blood circulating, because notice you can't use anybody at your table. That means you're going to get up and move around. When our 5 minutes is up, you will hear, and you know that we're ready to stop. So let's go for it. Let's see what you can do. See who you can find. You have to get up.
Here we go.
Part, you know, blowing the train whistle. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. How many people started to talk to somebody that you want to talk to some more? Yes. So this was just the beginning of your networking opportunities that you can have tonight, and of course continue after we're done here. So I want to know, who did we find, and I just want you to kind of raise your hands, who has taught over 50 sessions in a virtual classroom? Who's out there that has? I want you to stand up. I want these, because these are really the experts. Who else? Just one? Okay, good, more, 2 or 3. These are the true experts. If you want to know the real scoop, talk to these guys later on. Good. How many, who's out there that's taught 25 or more sessions? We'll just lower the bar. Okay, so we've got some folks in that arena too. Good, so these are the people that really know the real scoop and that we want to talk to about realities. Now tools, this is not a session about tools. But some of the common ones are like WebEx. Do we have any WebEx folks out there? Okay, I see a few of those. How about Centra? Centra is another popular one. It used to be Breeze, but now it's Adobe Professional Connect. We got any of those folks out there? Personally, I use eIlluminate. Anybody else use eIlluminate? eIlluminate is used a lot in the academic school setting. So I find them really useful. Who did I leave out? Wimba. And how many's a Wimba user? Wimba. Okay, good. Who else did I leave out? Interwise. Got any Interwise folks? Don't want to leave anybody out here. But as you can see, we've got a myriad of these different tools. And when I'm not working in my tool, I always get somebody to help me. But basically, they have similar functionality. You just got to learn how to, press the right buttons and make it happen. I'm sure you found some unusual hobbies. We don't have time to go through those, but I'll leave that for your entertainment section later on. Whatever unusual hobbies. Who's with the government or military here tonight? Okay, good. Not surprising. We are in that part of the country. How about technology? We got some technology folks? Okay, good. They're in the back. Isn't that interesting? They're on the fringes out there. Okay, good. And how about education or healthcare? People in education or healthcare. Okay, good. A lot of representation. Apologize if I left you out. I know there's miscellaneous folks out there as well. What about e-learning? Now, this is a year old, this data. So it'll be really interesting to see what we find out this next year. But e-learning, and this is mostly corporate, okay, mostly corporate, accounted for about 1/3 of the delivery, e-learning. And out of that 1/3, I was really surprised to see that only 1/3 of that was the synchronous form. And I have a feeling this year it's going to be a bigger slice of the pie, particularly, as travel costs have gone up and so forth. So 2/3 of the e-learning was online self-study, the asynchronous flavor we looked at, and 1/3 was this virtual classroom type. It'll be interesting to see how this meshes out. Some of you may be familiar with Brandon Hall and get emails from him and so forth. So we had an argument about 10 years ago because he was absolutely persuaded that e-learning was going to pretty much do away with all face-to-face events. I said, oh, I don't think so. So he owes me a dinner if anybody sees him. My guess is, instructor-led training last year was about 65%. Again, this is corporate. I think we're going to maybe level out around 50-50. We'll see how things progress over the next few years. There's no substitute for that human face-to-face interaction. That's not going to go away. And what we learn is all media have their strengths and weaknesses, right? So we're going to use all of them. Now, I want you to have a little table discussion. This is going to be a quickie, like 2 minutes. Many of you your organizations are using some form of virtual classroom. Why? What are the reasons that your organization would use one? I'd like you just to discuss with the people at your table and find out the reasons for using a virtual classroom. Okay, let's talk about some of the more common reasons. And I'll ask you to add to my list. Okay, so how many had this as one of your reasons? Yeah. So the main thing that we immediately go to, of course, is, we're going to save travel costs, right? Money. But what's the other big expense? In fact, we already talked about it once tonight, and that was time away from the job. So there are two important economic arguments right now for the virtual classroom. And as we know, fuel costs are going up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out as far as media is concerned over the next year or so. It's going to be interesting to see how everything plays out over the next year or so. Here's the other one, though. We talked about time in terms of less time away from the job. The other interesting thing of time is how many of you have developed asynchronous e-learning? It can be labor intensive, right? It's all labor intensive if you do it right, but in general, you can develop a synchronous. If you have highly volatile content or something that needs to get out there relatively quickly, it's faster in general to do effective synchronous e-learning. You can put together faster, partially because you have that instructor there, and the instructor is that magic person who can fill in the gaps, compared to an asynchronous where you have to rely almost solely on the programming, the practice, the feedback, and all of that. So in general, it's a little bit faster to put together, and you can get it out there, disseminate out quickly. So time is another one. This is an obvious one. How many brought up the issue of accessibility? So if you have a global thing, and we tend to think of accessibility in terms of geography, but there's other forms of accessibility, right? So I've had people in my class that said, this was wonderful because 2 months ago I had a baby and there's just no way I could have flown to your workshop. So to bring the training often to where people are is a wonderful benefit, accessibility. What else? Okay, here's my little guy here. Who is he? Well, he's my symbolic avatar for an expert. Sometimes you might have some training that's really about some real specialized thing, or an element of it is about where you really want an expert to come in, but this is a valuable person who's very busy. And so you can bring this expert into the virtual environment and let people ask questions. For example, maybe you're doing a training on hiring interviews, and you want people to understand, the legal issues. And you've gone over it maybe in the class and so forth, but now they have questions, and so you can bring in, the corporate legal staff to come in, answer those kind of questions and so forth. So dissemination of rare expertise is another common, reason to make use of the virtual classroom. Dissemination of rare expertise. This is what I love about the virtual classroom. I have classes that are, when I do them in a face-to-face session, they're 2 days long. And that's wonderful. I mean, we have good events, we have good face-to-face communication. Those same classes, though, I also offer in a 5-day virtual session. We meet about 2.5 hours each day. Where is the learning more powerful? I found it so much more powerful when it's spread out. Because after you've gone to a real 2-day intense event, you're just overloaded. Your mind is overloaded. We call it cognitive overload. Whereas if you've spread it out, people have some time to kind of, think about that stuff. And if they want to go back and read something in the book, they can. And think about how to apply it, have the questions the next day. So my ladder is extending learning. We had the opportunity, I think, to extend learning. And of course, dividing across different types of media. So it's very common in the corporate sector. Before you come to a face-to-face event, you're maybe going to be in an online event. It may be synchronous, it may be asynchronous. So blending and mixing the media to extend learning across time is a real benefit. And these little guys, these are my representation of what I call social presence. So tonight, right here, we have a lot of social presence. You have face-to-face immediacy. Well, compared to the asynchronous classroom, where yes, you can have a discussion board and so forth, but in synchronous, if it's well used, you can have a lot of social presence. You can get people talking to one another, communicating with the instructor. And so it's kind of an intermediate between the individual self-study isolated and the face-to-face. So those are the most common reasons that people will bring up for the benefits of using a virtual classroom or fitting it in as one part of your overall delivery strategy. Now, I'm going to show you a sample, and I'm going to ask you to grade it. In fact, you've got a little place in your handout to give it a grade. Now, the grade is going to be on how effective you think it is from an instructional perspective, how effective you think it is, and then why. This is if I can wake up my computer. There it goes. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I go through the objectives of what we want to accomplish today, I just want to go through the structure and the agenda. I have put together a presentation that's not going to last too long, and then I'm going to display an application. So whatever we'll be discussing, the key theories, philosophies, approaches, I will then tie it up with an example of what we're calling an application for distance learning. Then I'm going to allow a question and answer period. Due to the number of people on this session, I like to hold the question and answers off till the end so I can capture the most frequent and most interesting questions for the entire group. So please, if you can, hold off your questions. In my opening statement, we all recognize that distance learning is an excellent vehicle for specific applications, specific educational applications. What we're going to look at today is how to maximize the effectiveness of distance learning. And the bottom line is how we're going to increase the productivity of the individual and team performance while reducing costs. So that's what...
Okay, so you got a flavor for it. And of course, we're just looking at one little segment. But overall, based on what you saw there, as you think of it from an instructional perspective, if this was representational, how many of you would say, I'd give it an A or a B? Okay, good. One nice grader here. Anybody else? Okay, good. Another nice grader. How many would say, I've seen better or worse, I give it a C? Okay, more. Let's see who the tough graders are. How many say, no, it's more of a D or an F? Whoa, tough group here. Okay. So what I want you to do is have a quick table conversation. Tell them your grade and why. Let's see if we change any of those grades. Go ahead and have a little discussion. What was good, what was not good? Okay, who changed their grade? Anybody change their grade? Any grade changing? Lower. Some people lowered their grade. Okay. All right, well, one of our themes is going to be whatever delivery media we're using, we need to exploit all the capabilities of that media for effective learning. Did this really exploit all the possibilities? So I think we could maybe do a little better. So we're going to explore some opportunities that we might have. And in fact, I want you to kind of work with me here, and there's going to be a little activity for you. So before we get into the specifics, you actually have a place on page 3. I want you to think of some kind of a topic that you have taught or might teach or are teaching, and just kind of jot it down, a little topic or skill that you could or have taught in a virtual setting, because I'm going to get you to work with it as we go along. So let's just give you a little minute to think for yourself. This is an individual activity. Just jot it down on page 3 so you have something in your mind. You might even have 2, because one might say, oh, I like this one better than that one. 1 or 2 ideas. Okay, everybody got something kind of in the back of your mind that you can work with. Good. All right, here's a question for you. I'm going to take our favorite topic, which is statistics. Do we have any statistics teachers here tonight? Okay, so good. I actually quite like statistics, but for some of us, it's not our favorite topic. So let's say you have to take statistics. You can take it in a face-to-face environment, or you can take it on online, and let's say asynchronous online, just to draw a contrast here. So the question is, I don't want to ask what's in your heart, but I want to ask where you think you'd learn more effectively. So how many of you say, you know, for me, I would learn more effectively in the face-to-face classroom environment? How many would say that? Okay, quite a few. I'm going to say over half. How many say, for me, I'd learn more effectively in the computer environment? All right, good. We've got some advocates there as well. And if you have some table discussions, which we won't take the time for, but face-to-face people will often say, I want kind of that social presence. I want to be able to talk to the instructor if I don't get it. I want to talk to my colleagues. I want to be able to ask those questions. I have some math anxiety, so this will be supportive for me. And the people who are on the computer side, they'll say, you know, I want to go at my own pace. You know, and I want to go back and revisit something if I want to, and I can go faster or slower and so forth. So who's right about that? Well, what does the research really tell us? We've had over 50 years of media research. Of course, this was way before my time, right? Way before any of our time. But every new technology that comes out, this young man and I were already talking about, you know, the new three-dimensional worlds and so forth. I mean, there's always going to be a new technology. And so people always say, is this going to be better for teaching? We have 50 years of media comparison. One of the first was done by the Army. Have anybody here from the Army tonight? All right, good. So one of the first was done by the Army. And this was in 1947, way before any of our time. But what was the sexy media, do you think, of 1947? Radio. It was after radio, so it was a little bit beyond that. It was film. It was film. And the Army said, you know, we could save a lot on these instructors by putting these lessons on film. So they said, but let's do an experiment and see if this is better. So they had a little lesson on how to calibrate a micrometer, and one version was on the film. The cheapest was print, self-study, and then we had an instructor. They randomly assigned students, they gave them the lesson, and then they tested them. Now, the one caveat I have to tell you is they wanted to be fair about it, so they used the same words and the same pictures, except, of course, the film was moving pictures, whereas in the classroom it was still pictures, and print, obviously, still pictures. Where was learning better? Which of these three media gave the best learning? Okay, how many vote for the instructor? All right, good. How many say the cheapest, the print? All right, we like that, save money. How about the film? Some film advocates here. Well, we've had hundreds of these studies because every new media that comes out, we go through these. And so what do we know from all these media comparisons? No significant difference in learning. Because why? What did I say? I said they used the same, basically, words, and they had the same visuals in all of them. So basically, this draws us to the idea of the difference between an instructional media and instructional methods, which are what really cause learning. We're going to dig into that idea a little bit more. I do want to show you some data to support this. Now, a meta-analysis is wonderful because rather than looking at one experiment or two experiments, in this case, they actually looked at 318 comparisons of face-to-face classroom versus various forms of electronic distance learning. And they took something called an effect size, which is just tells us the practical importance of the differences. They put them on a histogram. So an effect size close to 0 means for all practical purposes there weren't a lot of differences. An effect size close to 1 is a pretty high. That means, yeah, this is like a whole standard deviation of improvement one way or the other. So as you look at this histogram, what does it tell you? Well, we can see most of the effect sizes were where? Very low, right? Which tells us that really, as far as learning, and they were measuring achievement in all of these studies, as we've been saying, the majority of the studies showed not a lot of difference in learning. However, we see there were some outliers, right? We had in some cases, the face-to-face classroom gave much better results, and in other cases, the electronic distance learning gave much better results. How many of us have ever been to a face-to-face event, present company accepted, but a face-to-face event that was not wonderful? Yes. How about an e-learning that was not great? So what we know as training professionals, of course, is learning is not so much about the delivery media. We've been to face-to-face events that aren't good, and e-learning, but it's how we exploit the opportunities we have to support learning. And so this brings us to a distinction between three elements. The media I've talked about, but really the psychological ingredients of learning are going to be the modes and the methods. So a mode, basically, is how we communicate. It can be text, it can be audio, and it can be visuals, which could be either still or moving visuals. So of course, any delivery media we use, we're going to use some combination of those. The methods are all those powerful things that you do as instructional professionals. You give examples, you assign practice exercises, you give feedback. Those are all your instructional methods that really support learning. So those are the really important things for us to concentrate on. And I have actually a quick little exercise for you here to identify modes, media, and methods on page 4. There's a little story about Susan, and I'm going to give you a minute or two to read that story and identify the modes, methods, and media that she used. We'll take a minute and let you work on that. Okay, I know you haven't had time to finish, but I've popped some answers up here at front. You can steal an answer, compare to what you have, and just check yourself on the difference between a mode, a method, and a media. She was doing a blended learning, so she used several different media, computer, video, instructor, even the job card I would call a media. And she used all the different types of modes, visuals, audio, and text. And even some methods that I don't have up here, like practice, feedback, and so forth. So modes, methods, and media. And as instructional professionals, what really causes learning is going to be the best use of the modes and methods, no matter what media we're working with. So how do we know what's best? Well, our use of modes and methods have to connect with the human brain. And so we're going to take a quick little brain tour right here. I know it's late at night, so we shouldn't take too much of a brain tour. But we're going to take a quick look at our working memory and our long-term memory, because our modes and methods need to support our cognitive architectures, which is how we process information. So we're going to do a quick little test of your working memories tonight. Let's see who really feels sharp on their working memory. You ready for this? Okay. So now, can you reconstruct that chest? Okay, sorry, there's another chance, another opportunity for you. There you go. How was that? Well, happily, you don't have to do this, but there was an experiment where they did this. It was very interesting. This was the first experiment done where they compared expert performers. In fact, Greg was telling me that you have chess champions here at the university. What was it? They won big awards in the last several years, right? National Collegiate Championship. So, I mean, that's really cool. Well, so they had these chess experts, And then they had people like me. I fall the total novice category. They let them look at the chessboard, not very long, maybe a little longer than you did. Then they took it away and they had to reconstruct the chessboard. So now the question is, how many times did you have to look back before you could reconstruct it? Who had to look back more? What do you think? Who had to look back more times? Novices is what I hear. So here's the data. On average, we have the number of times along the bottom, the number of times, and then we have the number of pieces. On average, how many times did the master players have to look back? About. I want to be sure we can read this graph.
About 20.
The master level player had to refer back about 4 times to get all of the pieces memorized or back in place. And our poor beginners, after 7 or 8 times, they still weren't there. Probably got aggravated and frustrated with the whole experiment. But this is what you would expect, and you weren't surprised. But the question is, why? Is it that the master level chess player has a better visual memory, or they're smarter people? Is that why? Okay, so I hear an alternative, which is not that they're necessarily smarter, but that, in fact, they have some experience. So here's the interesting part of the experiment. It's part 2. Same experiment, but now the board is scrambled. Pieces are placed randomly on the board. So now let's see. Who's going to have better memory? Okay, they could be equal. Anybody vote for equal? Yeah, because now it's a scrambled board. Anybody vote for experts? Because they still might have an advantage. Anybody vote for novices? Okay, good. But most of us went for C. Do we have suspense over this now? All right, let's see what happened. So some of you were right on, right? What happened to these guys? Or maybe gals? What happened to them? So what does this tell us? So what happened is they were looking at a chessboard, they were looking at a world that suddenly had no meaning. And this tells us about the relationship between our long-term memory and our working memory. So it's our working memory that was memorizing that, but we were relying as an expert on our long-term memory. So for example, we all know that our working memory is limited. We used to say 7 plus or minus 2, but the latest and greatest is it's more like 4 or 5 chunks of information that we can hold and process. But what's a chunk depends on what you already have in your long-term memory. So for me, that little piece is a chunk, because sadly I don't have any experience with chess. But for a chess player, they have patterns, right? Patterns of information. And we know in all fields, expertise is about building these patterns in your long-term memory, which allows you to exploit them then and use your working memory much more efficiently. So while we all have the limits of our working memory, the expert has much more they can draw in. And if you've ever gone and worked with a subject matter expert, which I suspect 1 or 2 of you have, you've experienced this problem of lots of information coming out of these people because they know so much. And the value you bring to the table can be you don't know that. And so you say, you know, your learners aren't going to know that. So we've got to really break this down, and we've got to organize it in an effective way, et cetera, et cetera. So as you choose your instructional modes and methods, you're going to pick those that accommodate these features of working memory and long-term memory. That's all I'm going to say about that for right now. But we're going to now take a look at some of the research and see why, for example, a certain visual might be better than another type of visual in terms of the working memory and the long-term memory. We're going to look particularly at visuals, and then see how our time's doing. We're doing good. We're going to look at practice a little bit too. So here was a problem. Did anybody bring this up in their discussions at their tables with this sample that we saw? That screen had a lot of little tiny text on it. Okay, good. This young man here. Anybody else bring that up at their tables? All right, good. Because I would say in e-learning in any form cries out for visualization. You're looking at a screen, not a page. So let's get some ideas about how do we visualize content. I have to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rich Mayer, who has actually done the research I'm going to share with you. He's at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and he has been working steadily along, quietly, for about 25 years in multimedia research, and has a wonderful wealth of material. But as I said earlier, a lot of times it's hard for us as practitioners to get access. It's a lot of work to dig out all those papers and things. He has a lot of good features to his research. I want to point out two in particular here. A lot of educational research, appropriately, is directed toward children. But for those who are more interested in the adult community, we really need to see more from adults. And he works with, I would say, almost adults, so they're university students, usually between the ages of 18 and 22 years old. So at least that gives us, we're not working with third graders here in his research. The other thing I want to mention about his research is a lot of times in educational research, when they measure the learning, it's a memorization test. And I think in adult practice, we're much more interested in application, which his tests are application tests. That's what I mean by transfer learning, rather than a memorization test, rather than a recall or a recognize. So those are, I think, two real benefits for us of his research. As with all research, there are limits. And I just want to point out a couple here. In most cases, in the experiment, the students take the lesson and then they're tested immediately. So the data you're going to see is immediate learning. How would that extend itself over time? We don't have an answer to that. The lessons are relatively short, anywhere from 2 minutes to 10 to 15 minutes. So how would this extend over an hour or days? Again, we would just have to not know that at this point. The culture, mostly these are students at the University of California at Santa Barbara, so mostly this extends to a Western population. So, do graphics improve learning? Earlier we had a show of hands, and everyone was thinking, yes, they do. Let's see his research on that. He has a lot of experiments. This is one. The topic is how a bicycle pump works. He has a text version, so the students are randomly assigned to this one, or randomly assigned to this one. Not a fancy graphic, is it? But the same words with a simple visual. So where was learning better? How many say A? Words only. How many say B? Words and. Okay, we're consistent on that. So here's the data. You're absolutely right. So much better learning. He did this in lots of experiments, whether it was a narrated animation or still pictures. Adding a picture improved learning. In fact, he found overall he got about a 90% gain on the transfer test when he had even a simple visual like the one you saw. So you were absolutely right in your instincts that visuals are very powerful for learning. Good job. The reason is something we call dual encoding. The brain gets a chance to learn from the words and from the visuals. It's like you get a double opportunity. That's the reason given for the help of visuals. But before we end this story, let's talk about different types of visuals. This is a visual from actually an asynchronous course. It was a boring course. Anybody here teach boring courses? This was a systems application. No one's going to fess up to that. This was a systems application course. And they said, let's make this a little more interesting. This is such boring stuff. Let's put in like a little fantasy theme. And when students get the answers right, you're going to help the hero or heroine. Make it a little more engaging. Is this a good idea? Is this a good idea? Well, let's see. So here was Rich Mayer's experiment. He asked this question. He had a lesson on lightning. This is the basic lesson. Of course, there were many more slides to it, but this is the basic one. And then the other half of the students got this lesson plus some really interesting stories about lightning. For example, what happens to an airplane that's struck by lightning? Or how people who play golf are often susceptible to lightning strikes. He had a number of little interesting stories about lightning. So let's see what you think. We had two versions, the basic and the enhanced, which was the basic plus the stories. So how many of you think we got better learning from A, the basic one? I think you're in the minority. How many think B? Oh, yes. Okay, let's look and see. So there's our basic lesson. Uh-oh. What happened? Yes, I heard this young man say it right up front. Distracting. Distracting. So this is what Rich Mayer calls his coherence principle. Now, before I become the total Grinch of training and say you're never going to have a story, no. Think about those stories. So they were all about lightning, right? They were on topic. But what were they not about? the learning objective, really. And they were quite interesting, so they really got your attention. And just as you were starting to learn a little bit about how lightning formed, wham, in came a really little interesting story. And then you had to kind of get back to that thread and learn some more, and then here came another interesting story. So distraction and disruption of building the mental model was, their reason for saying this is not a good idea. So learning is better with extraneous materials omitted. You want to be sure if you're going to use stories that they are engaging and related. And pictures. So what kind of visual should you use? I think I put this in a table for you, so you have it in a different format. And then you're going to have a little activity with this. I'm terrible with graphics and visuals, so I wrote a book on visuals. That's the best way. If you want to learn something, it's like teach a class on it, write a book about it, and you'll really learn that topic. So you have this on a table on page 6. And I'm not going to say a lot about it, just a couple of words, and then we're going to do an exercise. They did a study of textbooks. These were high school textbooks. They found 80% of the visuals in these high school textbooks served no useful instructional purpose. Why do you think they put all those pictures in those textbooks? Why do they do that? That sells books, doesn't it? People like to have visuals and pictures. So we need to get a little more visual literacy going here to use the right kind of visual. So oftentimes we rely too much on the decorative visual. That's a visual added strictly for aesthetic or humor. It's okay once in a while, but as I said, in many of these textbooks, they way overuse this kind of visual that did not promote learning. Representational visuals are okay. That's just showing what something looks like. If you're teaching about a motor, if you're teaching about a computer screen, you need to see it. So that's all well and good. I want to draw your attention, though, particularly to what I call the explanatory visuals. And on your handout, it's the last 4 if you want to add a little notation where it says organizational, relational, transformational, and interpretive. That's what we call explanatory visuals, visuals that depict relationships in your content. Explanatory visuals. An organizational visual shows you qualitative relationships, like a concept map. How many are familiar with concept maps? That would be an organizational visual. You all know relational visuals. Those are like pie charts and bar charts summarizing quantitative information. Transformational visuals show changes in time or space. If any of you have taken a computer lesson step by step, you do step 1, step 2, step 3. Those are transformational visuals. And interpretive visuals make invisible things visible. So anybody who works in science, you might see a picture of a representation of a molecule, for example. That would be an interpretive visual. Well, let's do a little quiz on this. Keep this table right in front of you. Here's a visual. And when you start a virtual classroom session, one of the things you often do is to show the interface and talk to, show the students, here's the different parts of the interface. So as you're looking at this and looking at your table, which type of visual is this one? Okay, everyone got a thought about it? Which type of visual is this one? There's our answer. Representational visual. You're really just trying to show, here's what the interface looks like. Here's the parts. Okay, let's try another one. Here's a familiar visual. You just saw it. What kind of a visual was I using there? Organizational visual, trying to show qualitative relationships, hierarchical qualitative relationships among content types. Let's look at one more. This is from like a high school class on genetics. And this is a simulation. The students can change the genes and see what happens to the dragon. See what happens to the dragon. What kind of a visual is this? Yeah, there's probably more than one possibility, but I think it's an interpretive visual, really trying to make the invisible visible, trying to give the learners opportunities to do genetics in a dynamic way. Okay, you have lots of opportunities for visuals in the virtual classroom. You have a whiteboard. In some tools, the students can engage with the whiteboard, like on this one, they can type, they can write, and so forth. But you usually will project your visuals through the whiteboard. You can usually play multimedia. So this is from a class we teach that involves interviewing. And we have a little quick video clip to show a model of how to do the interview. You can go out on the internet. So it's very popular. You can bring in different websites and display those through the virtual classroom. And application sharing is cool for anyone who's trying to teach computer classes. You can take any application on your desktop and project that out. And the students can see you dynamically working with that application. So those are all opportunities for visuals. So now it's an opportunity for you. You have on the bottom of page 6, I want you to think about that topic that about 10 minutes ago you wrote down. And I'd like you to sketch, and this is not an art class. Stick figures are fine. But I actually want you to sketch here at the bottom of your page. Try for an explanatory visual that would work with your topic. Remember, we have those 4 types of explanatory visuals. It can be organizational, relational, transformational, and interpretive. And you're going to share this with your colleagues. I'll warn you about that. So I'm going to give you a minute to give this some serious thought and see what kind of a visual you could come up with to go with your topic. This is the bottom of page 6. Okay, what I want to do now is take a minute and let you just, with the person next to you, or if you're in odd numbers and threes, show your visual, talk about it a little bit, what type of visual is it, and share that back and forth. Remember, it's not an art class, we're just doing an idea here. So share your visuals. Okay. How many people saw a really creative idea? How many people saw a creative idea in the visuals that you looked at? Not too many, a few. How many people use organizational visuals? Okay, good, that's a very powerful type. How many used relational visuals that would involve numerics? How many used a transformational visual that would show differences in change in time or space? Anybody use an interpretive? Those are kind of the most exciting types, an interpretive visual. Great. So what we need to do, and many of us, if you're like me, we grew out of a print media. We're not used to thinking in terms of visuals. As we move into any form of e-learning, we have to be much more visual in our representations. Does anybody here have the benefit in your organization of a graphic artist? Oh, you are lucky. Now, you can't turn them loose. You can't turn them loose because, they can sometimes get, carried away. But if you work with them and you come up with, they can come up with wonderful ideas where you kind of talk about the subject matter and what you're trying to do and what you want to represent. They'll have great ideas that you never would have thought of. So take advantage of those wonderful graphic artist people. Do you have anybody here who's a graphic artist? Grab that person, grab those people, all right. Great. People who start in the virtual classroom, what do you think the typical instructor says are their challenges? There can actually be quite a laundry list. One is if you're used to being face-to-face feedback, I can't see my students. I can't see those puzzled looks. I can't see them, what they're doing. So that's a one. The other thing is you have a number of things that you as an instructor really need to be simultaneously attending to, like chat messages coming in, what slides are coming next, is it time for a breakout room? There's a lot of things to kind of be monitoring. So your cognitive overload at first is not only the tool, but it's attending to multiple things at once. That's a challenge. But here's the biggest challenge. My co-author on the book was an artist, and she created some nice little cartoons to go in the book. So I'll let you take a look at this one. This is a common dilemma. So it's very easy. You can't see your students, right? It's very easy for them to be doing creative other things. Email, voicemail, all kinds of other things going on because, you can't see them. And so managing student multitasking is a challenge. Anybody, when you had your discussions, how many of you noticed, based on what you saw, this was not a very interactive, engaging session? And if you could imagine, if it continued on as it was going, they're going to go to sleep, or emails, or voicemails, or all other kind of cool things. So, but this is a wonderful environment for constant engagement, the virtual classroom. I find I can be in closer touch with my students than I can in a face-to-face event. I can be in closer touch by exploiting the interactive capabilities. I'm going to do a quick tour of research on practice. We all know practice is wonderful, but what kind of practice and where should we put it? And then we'll look at some options that you can use in the virtual environment to keep your students constantly engaged and going. So let's say you're teaching Excel, and it's time for a practice. You have practice A or practice B. How many of you think A is a more effective practice? Anybody? How about B? How many think that's more effective? Okay, good. So we're pretty much together on that. So what we know is we need to have application or real-world practice. I'm not going to go into the psychology. It's getting late. But basically, the brain needs, for transfer, needs to have real-world application kind of practice. You want to mirror the application or the job in your practice. This is an example now of airline gate agent training. They do not need to let you on the aircraft. Now, on the screen before this, they told them the 5 legal reasons that you can prohibit somebody from getting on an aircraft. And then following that screen, this is what I call a regurgitative interaction. Have any of you seen regurgitation out there? Yes. I'm happy to tell you, this is not the real training. This is my degraded, ugly version. Here's the real training, much better. So you have these passengers here, and when you click on a passenger, he or she expands in front of you, and there's a little dialogue. And depending on what they say, it's a drag and drop. You drag them to the airplane, or you drag them off the concourse. Such a great use of drag and drop. So you can see this gentleman here over on your far right. He pops up in front of you, and he says, yeah, I've had a few beers. How many? Maybe 30. You make your decision. So you can see how much more powerful a practice this is because it is real world based. And that's what we want to go for. So you guys were right on here. This is a much more powerful practice, actually using the application than listing steps. So that's our first rule, which is to make our practice job relevant. Okay, here's another one for you. Let's say we have 6 practice exercises. They're all the same, but they're distributed differently. So how many think A is going to be more effective? For the benefit of people who can't see, we have 2, 2, and 2. 2 in the beginning, 2 in the middle, 2 at the end. Or 3 in the middle and 3 at the end. So how many think A is going to be better for learning? How many think B? Okay, we have a small minority vote for B. So this is an experiment. Group A had 4 practice sessions all in one day. Group B also had 4 practice sessions spread over 2 days, morning, afternoon, morning, afternoon. We looked at learning right away and a month later. So let's see what happened. Here's Group A. They did all their practice in one day. Let's look at Group B. So, on the immediate learning, there really wasn't any difference. Anybody cram in college? Oh, we don't want to admit that here, probably, right? Did cramming work? Yes, it did. We passed that test. But a week later, did we have a clue what was in that class? So what this tells us is what we call massed practice when it's all together. It can get you through in the short term. And of course, in all cases, you're going to have some loss of retention. But it's much worse with mass practice than if you spread that practice out. In the virtual environment, you've got to keep your learners constantly engaged. Every 1 to 3 minutes, there's got to be some engagement. And fortunately, there's lots of ways to do that, to keep them going. So the answer here was A. A was better. The more practice, the better. How many say true? How many say false? Actually, you're all right on this one. It is true that if we have good practice, the more practice you have, the more proficient you get. But there's a caveat. It's at diminishing returns. So we have what's called the power law of practice, which means your greatest learning is going to be on your first few practice sessions. And then after that, you're going to continue to learn, but usually at smaller and smaller, increments. Now, if you're at a very high level of proficiency and you're someone like Tiger Woods, then yes, you're going to continue to practice because this much improvement can make a big difference. Here's the other side to this practice story, though. This is a great experiment. They had a class, the same content. One group had 22 practices, one had 66. They measured their learning, and they measured how long. The reason I'm showing you this is to emphasize the idea, yes, they gained 4 points. Now, is that significant? I don't know. But look the time investment it took to get that incremental gain. So all of you, or most of you, have limited time with your learners. It takes time to create practice, and it takes your learners time to actually complete the practice. So you have to make a decision here. How much practice should I have? Depends on the criticality of the task. If, like my husband, you are teaching new airline pilots, the practice is going to be fairly extensive, right? Because when they do that solo, you're really going to hope for a good outcome, right? But, maybe some of the topics you're teaching is not quite such a life or death issue. So you'll all have to make a value judgment here. How much practice is enough practice, given my constraints and given the criticality of the tasks that people are going to have to go out and perform? We can see there's a cost, and then we know the best gains are in the first amount of the practice. Let's take math. Imagine an algebra class, because that's where this research was done. Lesson A You had an example and then a practice, and then another example, another practice, etc. Lesson B, you had one, and lesson B is the way I was raised. You had one or two examples, and then lots of practice. Where was learning better? How many think A was a better way to go? Quite a few. How many think B is a better way to go? Who's not sure? Because I see a lot of hands not up there. Okay. Some people say, I'm not quite sure about this. This is really relatively new research on worked example. It's called the worked example effect. This is an example of a worked example, just a demonstration. Here's how to do it. So here's the data. And I think for anybody who wants real accelerated learning, real evidence-based accelerated learning, this is it. So not surprisingly, when you have to work all those practices, it takes a lot longer than when you have a mix of examples and practice. A lot longer. Let's look at the learning. The learning was actually a lot better when we had the worked examples followed by practice. Why? Because if somebody's new, if you're working lots and lots of problems, your working memory is all tied up in the working of the problem, and there is no free space for the actual learning. Whereas if you're studying an example, your mind, your working memory is free to study that example, and then you're going to try it in a practice. And then you're going to study another example. So it is faster and learning is better when you alternate an example with a practice. Now, there's a whole lot more to talk about with this, but happily we're not going to do it tonight. But lesson A in general is going to be more efficient and more effective for novice learners in an area. Summary. Let's be sure that our interactions are job relevant. Let's not have that regurgitation stuff. And you do have this in a table in your material. It may not look exactly like this, but well, at least you have a beginning of the table. What kind of practice job relevant? Where should the practice be? It should be distributed. How much? You'll have to decide. Depends on the criticality of your task. And yes, supplement with worked examples. So that's kind of our lesson. Now what I want to show you is the wonderful opportunities, and some of you know this already, that you have in the virtual classroom for interaction. So I want to show you a sample. And if you're familiar with Lance Dublin, Lance is just great. He's a colleague of mine. He does lots of these webinars. So he's a great model because he's keeping the learners constantly engaged, very visual on his slides, and lots of interaction going on all the time. So here are some of my most popular tips very quickly. You have polling. Polling is very good because you can do it very quickly, very easily, and everybody in the virtual session responds to a poll. You can usually make it anonymous, like in this example, the responses are anonymous, but we could see the overall aggregate results. Or if you want, you can also, in some of the systems, you can see what people actually responded. Sometimes you as the instructor want to see that and give feedback and so forth. So I use a lot of polling. The effectiveness of polling, of course, relies on you asking good, good questions, good multiple choice type questions. So polling is a good one. Of course, the whiteboard. This is somewhat tool specific, but in many cases you can type and write. Sometimes I've seen a blank whiteboard and the students actually come on and draw various pictures. They can engage with visuals that you have on there. So getting people engaged in the whiteboard. What's the limit here? If you're have 75 people in your class, you're going to have a problem because the whole thing's going to be a giant smudge, right? So you have to think about a way to do it. But it works very well if you have a small class size. Chatting. You're all familiar with chat. So I like to use the chat a lot, especially if I have an answer that's relatively short and defined. Like this is an Excel class, and rather than just yaddity to them about Excel formulas, I just put some up there, and I said I want all of you to type in, how do all Excel formulas begin? Look at the samples and type it into chat. That got them engaged in what I was doing rather than me just yadditing through it. And they're going to hopefully type in equal sign and so forth. So chat is a good one. And of course, they have questions that they can ask as they go along. Application sharing. Again, somewhat tool specific. But in many systems, you can bring up the application, and I'm going to do the first step. Like, okay, I'm going to say I have to go to a January profit. That's going to be cell B6. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to so-and-so. I want you to do the next step. So I turn the application over to them. And then we can do round robin and turn the application over to different people. So it's very engaging. And in some systems, actually, everybody can be working simultaneously on their own spreadsheet. So it's a little bit system dependent. But that's a great way for engagement. Audio. is really good. Some people are on a phone. Some are actually, going through the computer network. But audio is good. I like it for social presence. So there's real human beings there with voices. I like it for complicated kinds of questions that you can't just type out, or you'd be typing a whole essay into the chat. I mean, let's just get in here on audio. Brings up social presence. The downside to audio is it's usually one person at a time, which actually is how real speech should probably be. You should listen, but usually it's not. So I use audio not a lot, but I like to use the other little trick, and many of you as classroom instructors do this. You can say, hey, Bob, we just talked about the types of graphics. How would you apply that in your world? Well, if Bob's been doing his email or listening to his messages, like, oh. So I do that just every so often because I think it's valuable from a learning perspective. But it also gets their attention, and they never know when they're going to be called on. I mean, good instructors do those kind of little devious tricks, but in this environment, it's important. I love breakout rooms. So if you have a class even of 16 or 20, you can put 3 or 4 people, and then they have access to everything. So everybody can then get on the audio, everybody can get into the chat. So you have much more engagement in the use of a breakout room. When I do a case study, I'll put people in teams in breakout rooms, sometimes for a half hour or more, because they're working on something, and then they're going to show it to the whole group afterwards. So the breakout room is very powerful in the virtual classroom. Okay, this is going to be a homework assignment for you because it's getting late. I can see your eyes are drooping, and I don't blame you. I admire you. This is your own time here that you have taken to come out tonight. But your homework assignment is that topic you had, and you created a visual. Your homework assignment is to think about using polling, application sharing, chat, and actually creating some interactions that are job relevant, that are going to be interspersed throughout, all those good things that we talked about, not regurgitative type of interaction. Let's look at our true and false. Let's bring some closure to all of those burning questions that we started off with. Visuals improve learning. The answer, of course, as you all said, is yes, but there's a caveat, right? Relevant visuals improve learning. Relevant visuals improve learning. So especially those explanatory visuals that we talked about. More practice, the better, yes, but at a diminishing rate of return. So we saw that power law of practice. You have to make your decision how much practice you're going to have. I didn't have time to talk about this research, but this is actually false. And it's in the book. You can read the research on this. If you have a visual, it's better to explain it actually with audio in most cases. There's some caveats to that than text and audio because you overload working memory. I'm happy to talk. Anybody who's fascinated on this, we can talk later. We found out learning is not better in a face-to-face classroom than in a virtual classroom. It's not about the delivery media, is it? It's about how we exploit it for learning. It's how we support working memory and long-term memory. Yes, it is better to space out your practice. Learning is much better, especially long-term learning. Immediate learning, you may not see it. Watch out with your stories. Stories are good, and they're powerful. Just be careful that you align your stories to your learning objective and not have stories that might be related but irrelevant to where you're trying to go, because they are so powerful they can be distracting. So that's it. I thank you all for your time and energy. Again, I thank UMBC for hosting me here tonight. I'm happy to talk to anybody that has additional questions afterward. Thank you. Networking time to enjoy your colleagues.
Would you mind taking